Welcome to a special edition of Legal AF. We like to bring on professors and journalists, newsmakers, lawyers who are in the trenches, former judges. And now we've got the pleasure of bringing on to brief our audience on some amazing issues about aging in America. Two professors who are contributors, one an editor and a contributor to a new book that's out called Law and the 100-Year Life, which maps the issue of aging in America onto all of our institutions, political, medical, looks at it from not just, how are we going to pay for healthcare as we age, or what kind of home are we going to be able to live in or age in place in, but also our legal institutions, our judicial institutions, our political institutions, our transportation institutions. How does the fact that we are getting older and we're lasting longer impact our society? And this group brought together, led by Ann Alstott, professor at Yale, along with her colleague Abby Gluck, another editor, brought together a lot of different thinkers, deep thinkers in these areas, a lot of professors to talk about this issue. So I'm so pleased to bring on Professor Ann Alstott and Professor Ganesh Sitaraman to talk about the gerontocracy and the impact on political representation. And I think that's a great way to kick it off. So I don't know if it's Ganesh or it's going to be Ann. Somebody kind of let's introduce this book, The Law and the 100-Year Life, and your particular contributions to it to our Legal AF audience.
Great. We're glad to be here. Thank you for having us. Ganesh has a wonderful chapter that I'll let him talk about. But I thought I'd say something about gerontocracy, right? We're all thinking about gerontocracy. We're living gerontocracy, both in this administration and the last one. And when we watch TV, we see old people. And so a lot of people have started talking about things like maybe there should be a mandatory retirement age, or maybe we should have some kind of mandated representation by young people in politics. But I wondered, Ganesh's paper puts this in kind of a broader context about inequality in America. And so we not only see we not only see old people, but we see old rich people, and particularly old rich white people, and particularly old rich white men. Now, that might be fine with some people, but it might also be a problem.
Basically, the old rich white men, it's fine with.
The old rich white men they're loving it, right?
Right.
How should we think about inequality in politics? And I guess I'll stop there.
I think it's a great place to start us off in thinking about this topic, because I think one of the really striking things about the idea that some people could live to be 100 is that it's not everybody. And when you look at the data, it turns out that some people are living longer than ever these days in the United States. But it's not everybody. It tends to be people, as Anne said, who are wealthier and whiter who are living longer, and not people who are of lower socioeconomic status. And in that context, what that means is that you have this kind of skew in our political system of people who have more political power because they're living longer. They just get to vote for more years. But also, there's this other layer that happens here, which is it turns out that people have different preferences based on how old they are. Old people have different thoughts than boomers. Boomers have different thoughts than Gen Xers. Gen Xers think differently than millennials, who think differently than Gen Z, and whoever's after Gen Z, Gen Alpha, have different thoughts than everybody else too. And the fact that there are these different preferences means that you have this political system that may or may not take into account those preferences, or that may be dictated by preferences for people whose really best days were behind them. And so I think that's a real question for how we think about our government and our policies. When you think about gerontocracy, it means rule by the old. And if the old systematically think different things than everybody else, well, that's maybe a problem for what it means to have a representative form of government.
I mean, one of the issues that we're watching now, especially in the Democratic Party, is this friction between the young and the old, right? I mean, even though Bernie Sanders sort of straddles both somehow, you've got this, the AOC wing of the party, just to talk about the Democrats for a minute, and then you've got everybody else that's in power, which is, the Mitch, the Chuck Schumers, and everybody on every committee is 60, 70, 80 or more. I mean, we just had, Dianne Feinstein, who probably should have resigned and retired well before she died in office. We just had a member of Congress who was in an assisted living facility or a nursing home memory care unit and wasn't doing her job. We know that. And we have this whole group of young people, the Max Frosts of the world in Congress, who are in their like late 20s and early 30s, whatever it is. And they want to get into the driver's seat, and they're being blocked by this. And we're getting older. We're not getting, and and the super agers are staying longer at the party, right? And so what do we do? Like you said, from a representation standpoint, what do we do about that? How do we divide up Congress by not just state representation or population representation, but by age representation?
Yeah. So, some people have talked about, mandatory retirement. So in some, like law firms, as you probably know,
Sure.
when you become a partner in a law firm, you promise and you sign a contract that says, when I'm 60, I will retire. So should we have something like that? Should we mandate something like that? And for whom? For Congress? For professors? That's one approach. Another approach that you're kind of suggesting would be to have some kind of, dare I say, quota based on age that says, okay, a third of your representatives from each state have to be under, even if we said under 50, that would be a big deal because we have a statistic in the book. It may be Ganesh's statistic, so I'm stealing it, that the average age of Congress is something like 65 or 70. So if we even had a quota for people under 50, that would be kind of a youth movement. Are those good ideas, Ganesh? Should we be thinking along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting is how many different ideas we could think about and how a bunch of these things have been tried in different places. So the youth quotas is a thing that a bunch of countries have done. And they've done it because they had large populations of young people who were protesting in the streets and were really pissed off about the government and willing to overthrow the government in some cases. And so they said, maybe instead of having, deep political revolutions, we should actually let young people have their preferences voiced through the political process.
And what countries were those, or are those?
So there's a number of them, but some of, I think, the most interesting ones are countries like Tunisia that experienced the Arab Spring, which was directly related to this kind of sense of deep disaffection, including by young people. And so I think that's kind of one model. Another is a version of what we have in the U.S. Constitution, actually, but with a slight twist. So the Constitution actually puts age minimums for certain jobs. You have to be 25 to be a member of Congress. You have to be 30 to be a senator. You have to be 35 to be president. And, I think what people normally say is that this was, to make sure that the people in these jobs had some degree of life experience and maturity and so on, kind of a proxy for that. But you can imagine having age maximums, on these kinds of positions. And if you really wanted to be radical about it, you could even say maybe age matters so much that we should group our bodies by age. The Senate partly is named a Senate because it comes from being old. The senile, also same kind of word, right? This is a body of old people.
Right.
But what if we said, okay, sure, to be a senator, you have to be old, but to be in the House of Representatives, you have to be young. And you could imagine designing a government that way. So there's lots of different things we could try out, if we wanted to experiment with thinking differently about age. And let me just say one thing about why I think that matters a lot. And this brings it back to your provocation about who we have in power now. Part of what's different about different generations is that they have different experiences that shaped them, whether that's wars or depression, economic conditions. They have different outlooks about the future because they're looking at the problems that might emerge 10, 20, 30 years from now if you're young as things I'm going to have to deal with, rather than if you're old as things you don't really have to deal with. And importantly, you also have a different connection to technology, both in your ability to use it, understand it, and think about it. And so, I think one of the things that's been most frustrating for people when they watch, say, the Supreme Court in oral argument, listen to those listen to those arguments, or watch Congress in some of these hearings where they bring in tech company folks. They really have no idea what they're talking about some of the time, as compared to young people who would look at this and say, I use all of these technologies. I know exactly how they work. I can think about these questions. And, like you said, that's not everybody, right? Bernie Sanders maybe is the exception that proves the rule. He's somehow old and young at the same time.
Yeah.
But there is a correlation between being an early adopter, being native to some of these new technologies, thinking about how they work, thinking about their downsides, and that's not represented very well in our system. It's not that it's not represented at all, but it's not represented very well, given that we really skew quite on the higher end in terms of age.
One observation on your constitutional thing, the min max, wasn't there a built-in max though? Because when those numbers were placed into the Constitution, the average lifespan was not 80. I mean, yes, Ben Franklin and a couple of them went longer. Old white guys who were wealthy sometimes in every generation last longer, apparently. But that was not was it 54, 56, 60, whatever it was in the 1700s? Didn't they already build in? They never anticipated an entire chamber of 80-year-olds, did they?
No, certainly not. On the other hand, age means, sort of that's exactly right? So average life expectancy at birth was extremely low, something like 50, and then you're right. It's always been, some people have lived longer, but of course, age means something different, right? You see all these articles in the papers I'm aging myself, the papers, right? On the websites, 60 is the new 40, and all of that. So
80 is the new 70.
80 is the new 70.
Right.
90 is the new, I don't know.
No, I've heard people say that's it. When you get to 90, it's just 90.
When you get 90 is 90, right? So that complicates things, doesn't it? That an 80-year-old to them would have been an almost unimaginably old, to pasture person. 80 for us, right? I wonder if we could, as we're thinking about these ideas, though, I wonder if we're missing something big in the room, which is the role of wealth in politics. And I know Ganesh has written a lot about this, but you could imagine that like somehow we had a magic wand and all of a sudden half of Congress has to be under 50 or something like that. Well, we've still got wealth in the background, and wealth in politics really matters. And I think that's a backdoor for age to come back into it, right? Because I'll let Ganesh talk now, but the distribution of wealth really matters.
I think that's right. And Anne just teed this up so well, because part of what you have when you have some people living longer than others, and your point about life expectancy is exactly right. It was lower back then, it's longer now. But like I said, it's longer only for some groups, not for everybody. And if you think about who that is, and partly it's people who are wealthier, well, that means you have more people who are wealthy. And if those people are also the ones in politics, you actually have a systematically skewed political system, not just because of Citizens United or because rich people can donate money or lobby more, but actually because the people in these jobs themselves are very wealthy and have spent a whole lifetime potentially being wealthy. The other part of this is just a very simple fact of compounding, right? If you're going to live for a very long time and you have a bunch of investments that you've made, you're going to do better over time because that money has time to grow. Younger people don't have as much of that, right? And so there is just a disproportional sense of how we think about this, that you're going to end up, on average over time with people who are older, who are also wealthier. And that's systematically going to shape our politics in a different way than if you had young people, even if the young people also might be subject to Citizens United and wealthy people donating money and so on and so forth. On balance, it's going to be a little different. And I think that's a really important part of the story here too.
One or both of you said earlier, it might have been you, Ganesh, about younger people especially, or they're shaped by as we all are shaped by their experiences, and that as the throughput. I mean, I've had, because here on the Midas Touch Network and Illegal AF, I have a lot of interaction with people in their 20s and 30s who help us produce the show, who edit the show. We have one of them with us right now. Hi, Nico. that are all the behind the scenes in the world of YouTube and podcasting. And, we have a very good sort of family atmosphere here. We talk a lot to each other. And that's a gift that I'm able to talk to people in their 20s and 30s and about politics and about law. And I had a discussion with an editor of mine who lives in New York about the mayoral race there. And for me, and I'm liberal, I had a certain viewpoint about the leading candidate for mayor that comes from my own life experience, my religion, my political background, even though she and I are both Democrats. And she had a whole, none of the things that mattered to me mattered to her at all. Not even like one of those things. And I was like, okay. So she had a whole other thing that came out of her being a late 20 something, went to her colleges and her friends and her background and her life experience. And so we came out to completely different places on the grid.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, what's so important about this in terms of thinking about political representation, which is we are a gigantic country in size, in the types of people that we have, and in age. And what that means is there's a lot of people who have different kinds of experiences and different views. And politics is supposed to channel, reflect, manage all of those differences. But if you systematically have one set of people's views, one set of people's experiences, one set of people's preferences that make their way into our laws and our policies and not anyone else's, that's a real recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it makes me think of the story from the first George Bush administration, and the story may have been apocryphal, but it really was very powerful. Do you remember this, Mike? That George Bush Senior went to a grocery store,
Oh yeah.
and was amazed that there
Stared
was
at the
he was like,
codes.
yeah, right. He was like, you mean they just put the things on the belt and they know what the price is, and it just showed, again, maybe apocryphal, but the story got a lot of traction because it showed kind of he was very out of touch with, going to the grocery store. And, my own kids are in their mid-20s. And so I have those conversations all the time, right? That they're not taking for granted they can buy. And these are, these are relatively privileged kids. They don't take for granted they can buy a house.
Yeah.
They don't take for
Yeah.
granted they can afford to have a kid.
Yeah.
And they're not wrong, that their economic futures may look different. So their chance of being in that bubble at the top may be very, very different. And so finding a way for those voices to be heard is really important.
I moderated about 3 weeks ago in Miami, where I'm living with my wife and family, at a town hall for my party, in a church. It was about maybe 100 people. I'd say 70% of them were well over 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
But there was a small pocket of young people. And I mean, some as young as like still in high school, and then early college. And that group was asking questions that many in the room who were my age or older, that's not something we associate with being an American, which is exactly how you framed it. And when you said about your own children, which is they don't think they're going to own a house. They don't think about, how they're going to retire or where the money's going to come from, or that they're going to be able to beat, quote unquote, their parents' lifestyle. They're really the ones that express themselves, they're very worried that the political system has failed them, and they don't have a voice in it. And what they see is, as you said, this gerontocracy. Look, I love Nancy Pelosi like the next person, but she's pushing 90. Now, she did step aside for Hakeem Jeffries in a younger generation, much like in a law firm, like you said, up and out. The reason, we need to bring in the young people and reward them. And maybe the whole redistricting fight is not just about race, and that kind of representation, but also age. Could you imagine what the maps would look like if you gerrymandered around age, right?
Right. Yeah.
Whole different Congress. A whole different Congress. I'm so glad that we were able to brief our audience about just a fascinating issue. It's one I'm sure, regardless of their age, our audience is not thinking about. And I'm sure they were delighted by this conversation. And if you were, then you're going to love, if you love this, you're going to love the new book, Law and the 100-Year Life, which is out now, published by Cambridge. It's got and then Ann Alstott, a professor at Yale, and Ganesh Sitaraman, who's a professor at Vanderbilt, but a lot of other people, up to a dozen other contributors who looked at this through the lens of, what does it mean that and not for everybody, as Professor Sitaraman just said, but that we are aging and aging in place. And what does that mean along all of our other institutions? So down below is links to the book and ways for you to get it. And I'm so pleased that both of you were on. I'd love to have you back on again as you continue your scholarship and different types of things that would be of interest to our audience.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you. Michael Popok, Legal AF, talking about aging in America. Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.